Hey guys, happy Halloween. This is Emily Davis. I found an article this week called Deliver Me from My Deceitful Enemies, a Talus Contrafactum in Time of War. And the article is written by David Skinner. So in 1978, Oxford College was doing some renovations and they found these fragments of a piece of music in one of the walls. It was stuffing cracks. Stuffing cracks that had formed hidden behind plaster. And so scholars started looking at these pieces of music and they realized that the music was from the second contratenor line of a piece by Thomas Tallis called Gaude Gloriosa Dei Mater, I believe is, yes. But the thing is that instead of the original Latin text that is known to be is known for the Gaude Gloriosa, it had an unidentified English text that no one had ever seen before. And so they realized after doing a bit of studying of the piece that it was a contrafactum, which is a rendition of a piece where they don't change the form of the piece or much of the music itself, but they change the words. And so scholars began to try to figure out where this piece came from. Did Tallis write it? Why did he write it? When did he write it? Etc. So it's really interesting. First thing they wondered is how did a Tallis original manuscript end up in? Actually, it was a part book. It was the contratenor part book. How did that sections from that part book end up at Corpus Christi College in Oxford? And the best theory that they have is that Thomas Mulliner, who was a contemporary of Tallis, who was actually, they believe, younger than Tallis by a little bit. Since they were contemporaries, Mulliner might have had a part book of Tallis's, and Mulliner worked at Oxford, so whenever Oxford needed paper to stuff the cracks with later, whenever, they just took the paper from that part book, not realizing that one day it might be historically significant, stuffed it in cracks in the wall and covered it in plaster. So the next thing that they started wondering is how to date this piece, and so they were looking at the watermarks on the parts that the parts of the parchment that they found that had vellum. It was vellum. Trying to find the watermark and trying to date the watermark, and they think it was probably done in the mid 16th century, so 1540s, 1550s. They realized that this was different than the Gaude Gloriosa that we have passed down in the Elizabethan version of the Gaude Gloriosa. And so they started realizing, okay, this is probably based on an earlier version, which proves that not only did Tallis edit his works, but sometimes he did it like decades later. Because, like I said, this was dated mid 16th century, and the Elizabethan era was 17th century. Approximately. Late 16th century, early 17th. So they ended up, they realized that the text that was used in this version of this reworking of the Gaude Gloriosa was written by Catherine Parr, who was Henry VIII's final wife. And it was a translation done by Catherine Parr of another work done by a man named John Fisher, who had fallen out of Henry VIII's grace, but Catherine Parr still really liked his work, and so she translated it. And at the same time that Catherine Parr was writing this piece and ended up publishing it, Thomas Cranmer was writing and was translating and writing and publishing his version of the Catholic litanies in English. Because Henry VIII was a very strong believer that prayer was an essential part of being a successful monarch. and having loyal subjects, and he was afraid that the original litanies were too difficult to understand even for the people who were trained to speak them. And so he had them rewritten in English, and this was after his Reformation, his creation of the Anglican Church. So, and Parr's book was called Psalms or Prayers, and Cranmer's book was called Exhortation and Litany. These books were published separately, but in 1544 in April. Were separately, but in later editions they were bound together in the same book. So Skinner hypothesizes that the reason this was done was because they were meant to be complementary to each other. They were meant to sort of be an implementation of each other. So Skinner asks, why were these written? And what does Talus's deliver me from my deceitful, or what's it called? Yeah, deliver me from my deceitful enemies. What does that have to do with, what are these all have to do with each other? So this is taken from the 9th Psalm, from Psalms or Prayers. And it's very warlike and very angry. So in the 1543, 1542, 1544, England was in the middle of a war with Scotland, and at the same time, the disagreements between England and France was intensifying, which was going to lead, it ended up leading to the English victory at, I cannot remember the name of the place. It ended up leading to English victory in France. But in May of 1544, right after the litanies and the Psalms or Prayers was published, there was this big celebration called Rogation Tide, and this happened in the week leading up to Easter every year, and they said except for the actual Easter services, Skinner says that this was a very patriotic and unifying time of the year. And so at the same time, Henry's forces were returning from Scotland, coming back victorious. And so Skinner suggests that Thomas Tallis, having received this text in April at the earliest, maybe a little earlier if Catherine Parr had given him the text before it was published, that he wrote this piece as a celebration of Henry's army's return from Scotland. Now, Tallis at the time, starting in 1543, was working at the Chapel Royal in England, which is why he probably had access to prayers or psalms early. He might have had access to prayers or psalms early, and he probably wrote this specifically under Henry's and Catherine's orders. This is all what Skinner is suggesting. We can't know for sure exactly what caused the writing of this piece, anything like that, because no record remains of exactly what happened the day of that celebration, except for the fact that there was a Te Deum sung. And Te Deums were normally reserved for celebration and Thanksgiving, which if Henry's army was returning from Scotland, that would make sense. So they're suggesting that this psalm that is very angry and very warlike was kind of set as a celebration for the return of Henry's army from Scotland. Now, the last question that Skinner really had was that did this come first or did the Gaude Gloriosa come first? And Skinner says that the way the text is set, the 9th Psalm had 30 stanzas and only 24 and a half of them were set. And the way it was kind of shoehorned in, because they had to like chop off part of, I think, the ninth stanza, and then they didn't do anything after the 25th. Skinner suggests that it cannot have come first, because Tallis would have likely said the entire text did not cut parts out if it had been him, if it had come first. The Gaude Gloriosa was, no one knows where the text comes from, but his appointment before he went to the Chapel Royal was in the new foundation Canterbury Cathedral. And in the new foundation Canterbury Cathedral, there were 7 Gaude invocations set in stained glass, where it showed different depictions of Mary throughout her life and throughout Jesus' life. And so there were 7. There are 9 verses of the Gaude Gloriosa. So, but they're thinking that the most likely source of the Gaude Gloriosa is inspiration from the windows and the stained glass, because no one knows where the actual text comes from, and so that's Skinner's biggest guess. What I really like about this is that I just love history, and it's really difficult. This time of history, there's not many records kept, and not very good records kept, and the records that were sometimes were kept are sometimes lost. And so it's just interesting to see how modern day scholars interpret, okay, so I have this part of this piece of music. How do I date it? Where did it come from? Why was it written? And so it's interesting to see how scholars kind of interprets what they're seeing just from a single line from a part book. They get an entire work, a votive antiphon. I kind of wish that this had focused more on Tallis's style than it had on the origin of the text and the reasons why. However, it's still useful because you can kind of see what was going on in Tallis's life at the time that the piece was written, and this was an earlier Tallis work. But it's at the same time, you know, it's just I still just wish that there had been more about his style and less about everything else that was going on. I think this will be really useful still, just because it will give me a lot of information, and getting to see how he edited one piece to fit into a different context. So I'm probably going to look more into the Gaude Gloriosa and see how that relates into the other work. But thanks, guys, and again, happy Halloween.